Well, good morning, Factory, and everybody over at the fire hall and the warehouse, and our friends up in Churchill. Greetings and welcome to the very first in our series on the book of Revelation. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but sometimes you watch a commercial, and most times I try to mute it, or I try to fast forward it, or I try to ignore it, but occasionally a commercial will really suck me in. And I don't know if you know this or not, but these days producers are using something called neuromarketing strategies. And so what they're doing, I heard of this recently, they actually took a car and they took 15 men and women and they put these electrode caps on their heads and they told them, here's your assignment, walk around the shiny new car for an hour and look at every single little detail and spend time looking at each part, and they mapped this out and they got all the data, and then they used that data to create a commercial based on the parts of the car that get men and women their electrodes and their emotions most stimulated. And I thought, wow, that's fascinating. I would love, at the factory and the warehouse and fire hall and up in Churchill, I'd love to give all of you electrode caps right now. And I would love to say a few words. Like, I'd love to say the phrase, the book of Revelation, and then see what happens to the data. Then I'd love to get you to read a few chapters out of the book of Revelation and watch the data, because my guess is that we're going to have all sorts of different responses to the book of Revelation. Now, I'm not going to be able to strap all of us and get all the data, with these electrode caps, but that's okay, because I've got piles of deep data over a span of 50 years of my own responses to the book of Revelation. And I decided to sort of map this out a little bit. And so as I map this out, here's what I kind of came up with. Frightened, 86 out of 100. Like I read the book of Revelation, and there's just scary stuff in there. Confused, 89. Intrigued, about 19. Not that intrigued, but anxious, 91. I mean, my emotions are peaking on the anxiety. Encouraged, yeah, I'll be honest with you, about 13 down there, and hope-filled, about 15. Now, some of your responses are completely different. In fact, if you have the Riverwood app, there's a note page there, and you can actually enter some of your responses and kind of see where you map out. But this is my personal sort of experience with the book of Revelation over the last 50 years. And I would say that there's probably a number of you that have the same kind of responses. Now, our production team is entirely made up of young adult millennials, and I love them. I love working with them. But we were working on the book of Revelation a while ago, and one of the guys walked by, and quite sincerely, but sort of offhandedly, he says, "Oh, I just love the book of Revelation. It's so full of hope." And I went back to my office, and I was thinking, are you crazy? Like, are you entirely nuts? Like, do you not know that the book of Revelation is the most terrifying, end of the world as we know it, future predicting, judgment unleashing piece of literature known to mankind? Have you even read it? I mean, it's about these four horsemen of the apocalypse that unleash this craziness upon the earth, and this Antichrist that tricks us into 3.5 years of peace and then unleashes like these horrible things upon us. And then God's wrath comes with nuclear war and heinous murder and starvation and economic collapse and earthquakes and meteorites crashing out of the heavens and disease and tribulation, and 1/3 of the sea and ships are wiped out, and 1/3 of the forests and vegetation is torched, and there's trumpets and seals and bowls and 100-pound hailstones that pummel the earth, and incurable boils, and horses with tails like snakes that eat people and sting people, and a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns and 10 crowns, and a red dragon, and the number 666, and the Antichrist, and Christians who refuse to get the mark of the beast can't eat or do any economic stuff. And you love the book of Revelation because it's so full of hope? I mean, are you kidding me? It was in that moment that I thought, I need to start random drug testing on our staff. I mean, like, this just doesn't make sense. Like, how could somebody have that reaction to the book of Revelation? But then I went back to my office again, and I thought, you know what? That single comment is motivating me. It's motivating me like never before to take an honest look at this book and to say, what does the book of Revelation really mean? How are we supposed to interpret it? Why in the world would God even include this in His Bible? How are we supposed to figure out what it means, and why is it that some of us have such high levels of anxiety and terror around this book, and others look at it and say, oh, this is wonderful, I love this book, it's so full of hope. Well, let me tell you my story. So I grew up as a kid in the 1970s and 80s, and if you were in church world at that time, You probably remember this, that everybody was talking about the end times. Everybody was talking about end-time prophecy in the book of Revelation. If you wanted to fill your church on a Sunday night, you had a guest speaker on prophecy or a prophecy conference, and everybody was interpreting what the book of Revelation meant in current times, and we were identifying the Antichrist and all this stuff, and it was really intense. What was driving all of that was a little book that was published in 1970 called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. Printed about 35 to 40 million copies. And Hal Lindsey, a Bible scholar, did something that nobody had managed to do up until this point. He showed us conclusively, out of the scriptures, how it was proven that from 1970, when he wrote this book, that Jesus was going to return within the next 18 years. It was just proven. So he pointed us to Isaiah chapter 66. I mean, how could you argue with this? Who has ever seen anything as strange as this? Who has ever heard such a thing? Has a nation ever been born in a single day? Has a country ever come forth in a mere moment? But by the time Jerusalem's birth pangs begin, her children will be born. And he said, look, that is obvious. Everybody knows that that is the birth of the nation of Israel in 1948. Now, do the math, because this is what Jesus said in Matthew 24. I tell you the truth, this generation that sees all these end-time things come true will not pass away from the scene until all these things take place. So the math is pretty simple. 1948 plus a generation, which is 40 years, equals 1988. Jesus is coming back, and the rapture will occur on or before 1988, guaranteed. Now, in case we couldn't imagine what this was going to look like in our lifetime, movie producers got together and created 3 movies that were circulated through our churches: A Thief in the Night, A Distant Thunder, and Image of the Beast. And then somebody came up with a book called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Happen in 1988. And again, conclusively showing us out of the scriptures how this was true. Now, so you got to realize, I grew up from age about 5 to age 23, and I was imprinted with these incredibly powerful ideas that the book of Revelation was a code book. It was a map to be deciphered by the smartest of Bible scholars, and only the really spiritual smart Bible scholars could figure out and decode this thing. And when they did, it showed a picture of Jesus coming back, but this was a Jesus like we'd never seen before. This was a Jesus full of wrath, and full of victory, and full of judgment, and ominous events. And you better hope and pray that a pre-tribulation rapture is actually true. And then something fascinating happened. 1988 came and went without a sign of Jesus' return. And we were all sitting there kind of scratching our heads for a little while going, well, hold it a second, this was guaranteed. We grew up with this idea that Jesus was coming back in our lifetime, and shortly after that, the guy that published 88 Reasons Why Jesus Was Going to Return in 1988 quickly published 89 Reasons Why Jesus Was Going to Return in 1989, and that book didn't sell so well. But, we kind of forgot about this stuff for a little while until there was a little blip on the end times radar in 1999, and this was sort of worldwide with the Y2K bug, and prophecies began to come up that Jesus was returning by December 31st, 1999, the new millennium. And so, we all went to our parties and we counted down with the Big Apple. And when we got to 0, us Christians kind of held our breath. He didn't come back again. I thought he was scheduled to come back, but he didn't come back. And so we, the end times wind was sort of taken out of our sails. And other than the 16-volume Left Behind series, which sold 65 million copies and spun off a couple of movies, and then a couple of thousand billboards across the United States announcing that Jesus now had a new scheduled date, May 21st, 2011, that this was when he was going to return. And in fact, they wanted to make sure everybody got the message, so they put on the billboard, "The Bible guarantees it." Yeah, that was great, eh? The Bible guarantees that he's coming back in 2011, and most of us that grew up in the 70s and 80s, and our millennial friends don't understand this, but by that time we were end times exhausted. We had had so many promises that Jesus was coming back, so many signs, so many, this guy's the Antichrist, this woman's the Antichrist, and we were just exhausted. And the billboard that somebody hired to put up right after the May 21st announcement sort of summed it up for all of us. It said, well, that was awkward. And it was. It was incredibly awkward. But it was more than just awkward. It was more than awkward because these calendarizers, these date setters that kept setting dates, they were robbing the rest of us Christians of our Christian witness and something else, a simple thing called credibility. Because we were all lumped in with this, and I don't know if you felt it, but reading global news or some of the UK news or some of the big, Fox News or the different stations last month, the book of Revelation, chapter 12, announces that the world is going to end on April 23rd, 2018. It was all over the media. It was all over the social media. And you just had to cringe again and go, oh, no, don't do that. Don't do that to us. Because April 24th came around and we're still all here, and it's like, you just stole our credibility one more time. So when this guy in the office, innocently enough, said, I just love the book of Revelation. It's so full of hope. He was short-circuiting 2 decades of childhood terror that was in my soul. Intimidation that only the elite could know what it means. Shame, as I was guilty by association with all these calendarizers who kept coming up with dates and robbing us of our credibility. Feelings of being out of touch because I really had sort of been left behind because I hadn't looked at the book of Revelation since, for about the last 20 years. And then kind of a low-grade guilt that here I am a pastor and I'm purposely avoiding the book of Revelation. I should not avoid any book of the Bible. And then confusion and uncertainty. And I recently had to admit to myself that just about everything I knew about the book of Revelation had been formed in some very formative years in my life by a bunch of Christian pop culture people who were telling me what it meant, but I'd never really taken a hard, objective look at the book of Revelation. I mean, I did in Bible school, but somehow my interpretation from childhood just sort of overshadowed that. And I thought, well, what would happen if we as a church applied some of the biblical principles of interpretation that we've been using over the last 23 years? We use it all the time. What would happen if we applied some of those basic principles of biblical interpretation to the book of Revelation? And so that's what we're going to do over this next 8 weeks. Before we start, though, I want to set some ground rules for how we're going to do this as a church. And here's rule number 1. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to disagree. You see, I began to set aside my personal biases and assumptions and all this very powerful emotional conditioning, and I discovered that there's more than one way to interpret the book of Revelation. I had never been told that. In fact, growing up, the insinuation was if you do not believe in a literal pre-tribulation rapture, being beamed up and taken away, if you do not believe in a literal 7 years of horrific tribulation, if you do not believe in that order, it's suspect whether you're even really a Christian. You probably aren't really even a Christ follower. That was the insinuation. But what I've discovered is that as you take a look at the book of Revelation, there isn't just one way to interpret it. I can assure you that there are Jesus-loving, biblically brilliant, highly intellectual, authentic, orthodox, intelligent, thoughtful, and authentic pastors and scholars who have set up camp in 4 different interpretation fields. And they're all Jesus lovers. They're all smart people. They're all very, very orthodox and authentic and legitimate. But there's 4 different camps in which you can approach the book of Revelation. So here's what I want you to do. At all of our sites, I want you to reach down and put your seatbelt on. Look over to make sure the person next to you has their seatbelt on, because we are going to start moving really fast, and it's going to get bumpy, because we're going to travel through the different 4 fields of biblical interpretation of the book of Revelation. We're going to start in the first camp, and the first sign we come across is futurists. We've already sort of talked about this. I pick a little bit of fun on it from my own upbringing, but it doesn't mean it's not legitimate. These people love Jesus. They got some great scholarship. They're very smart people, way smarter than I am, and they are way more into their Bible than most of us, and yet they interpret and believe that there is a literal rapture where we'll be beamed up, and there's a literal time of tribulation. And the futurists believe that the book of Revelation is a map and a telling of the timeline of how the future is going to unroll at the end of time. And so they have these very elaborate maps that they will produce for you. However, they can't all quite agree on the details. So you have some that are pre-trib rapturists, so they believe in a pre-trib rapture. There's some that are mid-trib, in the middle of the tribulation, but before the really crazy stuff gets going. There's some that are post-trib, and in case you're not confused enough, there's some that are post-trib, pre-wrath rapturists, and then there's about 30 other distinctions. So they all sort of tussle amongst themselves, but they are all people who would come under this futurist. Now again, I want to let you know, they love the book of Revelation. They study the Bible very, very seriously. They are Jesus-loving people. They are authentic and orthodox and intelligent people. Okay, but that's their view. And that's the view I grew up with, thinking that that's the only view. Now, as we kind of take a sharp right out of that field and we bounce our way into the next one, I discovered that there's another group of people who have set up camp, and they're called the preterists. The preterists. Now, preterist means past. And so these are very scholarly people that have some great evidence for why the book of Revelation was actually accomplished and fulfilled in the first century. They say, hey, listen, this was to a bunch of people who were in persecution, and when you read this book, it's quite obvious to them that it was all fulfilled within the first century. Now, the futurists are going, you're nuts, that's heresy. But I want you to be open here for a second and realize that these people have studied the Word. They believe in the future coming of Jesus Christ. They believe in a heaven and so on. They just don't believe that the book of Revelation is a code book to be cracked, telling us the future to come. They believe that the future has already, this book has already been fulfilled in the first century. Now, jumping through the ditch and into the next field, we come to the historicists. The historicists, they love Jesus. They're intelligent. They study the Bible. They are authentic and orthodox and wonderful Bible-believing people. But they believe, as you look at the book of Revelation, that it's obvious that this is a telling of the different eras of history. Some of them start back at creation and say this is a telling of that story. Others say it's really after Jesus Christ. It's a telling of the story after Christ. But regardless, the majority of the book of Revelation, they say, has already happened in the past through all the eras of history. And we're in there right now. We're in one of those eras right now. We can find ourselves in there. And of course, it tells about a future coming of Christ and hope and so on. But it's not like it's a roadmap to just the future. These are historicists. Now, the historicists and futurists and preterists, they all sort of tussle amongst themselves. And let's just sort of round off the fields with the last one, which is idealists. And the idealists say, hey guys, you all got it wrong. This book has nothing to do with history or timelines or chronology. The idealist says this is all about principle. This is all about timeless truths. This is all about a picture of who Jesus is, and it has nothing to do with history, past or present or future. This is all simply telling us the characteristics of God. These people say it's all about allegory, and that it's an irresistible summons to heroic and faithful living, and it contains matchless appeals to endurance. And they say this really is simply a ripping open of heaven, showing us a picture of what's happening in the heavenly realms as Christ is guaranteed to overthrow evil. Now, at the various intersections and borders, Christians are often found, kind of lobbing verbal hand grenades and taking pot shots at one another who are in a different field. But that's not going to happen in our series. And the reason is because of rule number one. It's okay to disagree. I'm not going to try and change your mind. I'm going to teach us some things that I'm learning and that I believe, but I'm not trying to change your mind. If you're camped in one of those fields, enjoy your field. Enjoy that. That's awesome. In fact, I think it's great that we can all have different perspectives, but it's okay to disagree. So there won't be any need during this series to raise our voices at one another or send heated emails trying to convince others and calling them heretics or anything like that. We're simply going to say, hey, it's okay to disagree because you know what? Nobody's going to lose their salvation over this. You might have a different perspective, a different way of looking at it, but it's okay to disagree. Rule number two, we will learn with an attitude of humility. Now, I will confess to you that I'm not a big fan of the audience participation, repeat after me, say things to your neighbors sort of thing. I'm not a fan of that personally in public speaking, but we're going to do it right now, okay? So I want you to turn to the person next to you, and realizing this isn't part of our culture, but I want you to turn to the person next to you, and I want you to say, referring to me, I want you to say to them, hey, he might be wrong. On three. 1, 2, 3. Okay, there was a little too much enthusiasm in that. All right, and I heard some people over here say, hey, he's probably wrong. No, hey, he might be wrong, okay? Okay, now, those of you at the warehouse and fire hall and up in Churchill, work with me on this next one as well, okay? So I got one more for you, and I want you to say this. Turn to the person next to them and say, heck, I might be wrong. On three, 1, 2, 3. Okay, not quite as much enthusiasm, but that's okay. You're a little more hesitant to say that. But we're going to walk through this series, and I will guarantee you that I'm going to be wrong. I will not get everything right, and neither will you. There's no need for you to dig in your heels on your perspective, because I will tell you something. I've examined each of these 4 different fields. They have got some rock-solid analysis and reasoning and study, and they've all got holes in them. And you say, well, which one is true? Which one is accurate? I don't know. I do not know. I'm going to be wrong on some stuff. You're going to be wrong on some stuff. But here's what I do know. What we're going to do is we are all going to meet in the middle, okay, right here, right there. That's where we're going to meet. We're going to kind of come out of our camps and we're going to meet in the middle. And do you know what the middle is? The middle is the first 4 words of the book of Revelation. This is a revelation of Jesus Christ. This is a revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay, this is not a book that is a clandestine map, a code for you to figure out. It's not a crossword puzzle brain teaser. It's not an allegorical oddity. It's not a veiled and cryptic history book. It's not an apocalyptic crystal ball for you to rub and to figure out the future. It's not a script for a scary movie. It's not a book to be ignored. This is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so any other conversations, anything else is peripheral to that. And if we miss this, if we do not meet in the middle and get a new vision of who Jesus is, we have entirely missed the purpose of the book, no matter what camp you're coming from. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn from one another with humility. You're going to walk out of here and you're going to have a headache and you're going to be scratching your head and go, can what he just said be true? And you're going to go home to research and to figure things out and to ponder and to pray. You're going to try and figure that out, but we're going to learn from one another. And I will guarantee you that I'll be wrong and you'll be wrong, but we're going to do our best to learn. We're going to pray. And I encourage you for the next 8 weeks for this to be your prayer. Jesus, show me something new about you. Show me something I've never seen about you that you have in the book of Revelation. Teach me something I've missed. Teach me another perspective, because I want to walk through this book with a sense of excitement and anticipation and a teachable attitude of humility, and I want to get to know you better. And if you miss that, you've missed everything. So we're going to meet in the middle. Now, in case you think that following rule number 1 and number 2 is going to be easy, let me tell you this. That a number of months ago, as I started walking away from some of my assumptions and some of my biases and started studying these other perspectives, I started reading about the preterists and the historicists and the idealists, and I began to panic inside. I began to feel lightheaded. I got theologically disoriented. And I wanted to yell at many of these authors, heresy. And I had to come to realize that my psyche and my spiritual formation was so tied to the futurist view and to my upbringing that I thought anybody that challenged that was challenging my faith in Jesus. But when I began to set that stuff aside, I began to see that even though this was messing with my upbringing and some of my theological thoughts, it felt like it was messing me up. But as I began to work through it, I thought, no, okay, there's things I can learn here. And so we need to walk in humility, but this will not be easy. Some of you, over these next 8 weeks, will become angry. Some of you will become disoriented because you feel like I'm messing with the foundations of your faith, your world perspective. Some of you are going to get increasingly defensive and confused and disoriented. But that's why we need to keep remembering in grace, it's okay to have differences and to not agree. And we can even sit there and say, hey, what can I learn from you? Even though we have a different perspective, what can I learn from you? Now, I recently heard of a pastor who was preaching through the book of Revelation, and some of the people in his church, of course, kind of the same thing, but, didn't agree with his conclusions. And one Sunday, he walked out of church, and as he did, one of the people in his congregation that didn't agree with him shot him. And I just want to let you know that from my perspective, that is unacceptable. All right? So, we're actually going to make this. We're going to make this really obvious. Rule number 3: no shooting the pastor. Okay, so in case you were thinking that was fair game, no shooting the pastor. Okay, so with some of our biases exposed and some of our history sort of undone, some of our interpretation possibilities expanded, and now with the ground rules, let's begin to study the book of Revelation together. This is going to take us 8 weeks, but this is the beginning. Chapter 1, verse 1. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus. This is all about Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. This letter is from John to the 7 churches in the province of Asia. Now, my guess is that some of you have never read those words. You have formed an assumption. You have taken somebody else's teaching on an interpretation of the book of Revelation, but you've never actually even read the beginning words of the book of Revelation. And so we're going to begin by studying this. Now, any serious Bible school or Bible student is going to ask the Bible some questions. And we're going to do a lot of asking of questions. And so the first question to ask is, what kind of literature is this? What kind of literature is this? Now, last weekend, Pastor John did a great job of teaching this out, but I want to sort of review this a little bit. In the English, the beginning of this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, in the Greek, it reads this: Apocalypsis Jesus Christos. This is apocalypsis literature. It is the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ. Now, ask anybody at your school, anybody at your workplace, anybody at the office, anybody at the gym or on your team or around your dinner table, what is an apocalypse? And we have absolutely no problem answering what an apocalypse is. Everybody knows what an apocalypse is. An apocalypse is a universal, terrifying, cataclysmic event so catastrophic that it causes worldwide destruction, often involving meteorites plummeting the earth, nuclear war, extraordinary cosmic activity, sometimes zombies, extreme social, political, and environmental calamities. And it's a perfect definition of what we read in the book of Revelation. And so we assume that that's what apocalypse is. The only problem is it's not. You see, the people who would have picked up this scroll and read this letter, the first word was apocalypsis. And they would not have been panicking. They would not have had their terror meter going up. They would not have been covering their children's ears saying, "You can't hear this. This is too scary." When they heard the word apocalypsis, in English we say revelation, and their definition was this: a revealing of what is hidden, an uncovering, a disclosure or uncovering of knowledge. This is a package you get that's wrapped in brown paper, and you rip it open and you reveal what's inside. That's what an apocalypse is. An apocalypse is not all this terrifying, catastrophic stuff. It's simply a revealing of what is hidden. We've made it something that it's not. But when we begin with that description, we realize that this is not a frightening thing. In fact, the people that would have read this letter would have seen apocalypsis, and they would have gone, "Oh, we feel so honored. We're about to receive something that has been hidden about Jesus Christ, and it's about to be unwrapped for us. We're excited. We can't wait to see what this is going to be." They were not scared or terrified. So what kind of literature is this? Well, this is apocalyptic literature. And here's my premise: you have no clue what that means. And neither do I. And the reason is because, you see, in the Bible, there are 8 basic types of literature. Okay, there's historical narrative, there's legal code, there's poetry, there's wisdom literature, there's prophecy, there's the Gospels, the good news, telling the story of Jesus from 4 different perspectives. There's the epistles, which is another word for letters. And then there's apocalyptic literature. Now, 1 to 7 is pretty clear, right? We have examples of that. We work with examples of that all the time. We know what that kind of literature is. We're quite used to working with that. However, number 8, apocalyptic literature, we have no idea what that is, because apocalyptic literature is an extinct animal. You see, it only survived between 200 BC and about 200 AD. That's the only time it was written and really understood. So anything we know about this, we're having to look back at least 1,800 to 2,200 years in the past. And when we read it, we really don't understand what it is. So what we want to try and do today is take a piece of apocalyptic literature, and we want to extract the DNA out of it to see if we can learn something about what apocalyptic literature is. And as we extract the DNA, there's some things that come true about the strands of DNA. It's extinct, but then also apocalyptic literature is usually written in the context of oppression or persecution. It's not written in good times. It's written from oppression or persecution, or it's written to people that are experiencing oppression or persecution, and it's often called resistance literature because it's coming against the oppressive forces, and it's speaking against the oppressive forces. But because the present for these people stinks so bad, it's often preoccupied with the future. It's preoccupied with the people who are receiving this letter. It's preoccupied with their future, saying, hey, hang in there. I know you're being persecuted. I know that the government is coming against you, and we're resisting the government, but you got to realize that there's better days coming, and there's a future coming, and those who are full of tyranny are going to be dealt with. It's about encouraging those who are in oppression and persecution. And apocalyptic literature often uses discourse cycles. Now, it's kind of a technical term. You're not going to need it to know that for about 2 or 3 weeks, but I want to teach this out right now. A discourse cycle is basically that the writer will paint a picture with words, and then instead of moving on chronologically to paint another picture, they'll take the same theme and they'll paint another picture but about the same thing. So imagine somebody, an artist who's commissioned with celebrating the end of World War II. And they're supposed to commemorate in pictures the end of World War II. Well, this woman takes the first painting, this blank canvas, and begins to paint a picture of a torch with a golden and green earth with flames coming out of the top and words, peace for all time. And this is her expression of what the end of World War II was like. And then she moves over to the next blank canvas, but instead of saying what happened after that, she decides to paint another picture of the same event. But this time it's a couple, and he's obviously a military officer, and it's a sunny day, and she's got a wedding or engagement ring on, and they're smiling, and it's a bright future. It's the celebration of the end of World War II, but it's completely different than the first one, but it's the same event. And then she moves on to a third blank canvas, and she paints a yellow butterfly on a barbed wire fence at a desolate concentration camp. And she said, this is what the end of World War II was like. Now, it's not what happened after this couple got married and had kids. It's not chronological. It's simply another celebration from another perspective, telling the story of the very same event, but just in a different way. This is discourse cycles. When we read apocalyptic literature, often the writers are not so concerned with calendars and chronology and telling all the details of how this is going to come down or storylines. They're about revealing the hidden. And you'll find that as you read the book of Revelation, there's these cycles that some would believe are cycles of telling the very same story over and over and over again. Apocalyptic literature is extinct. We really don't know a lot about it. It's resistance literature written to those in oppression, persecution. It's preoccupied with the future, not necessarily 2 or 3 or 4,000 years in the future, but rather the future of the people receiving it. It uses discourse cycles, and apocalyptic literature communicates in pictures. Now, no matter what camp you're camped in, you're going to say, that's pretty obvious. There's a lot of pictures that go on in this book. That's pretty obvious. But the question we want to ask is, what kind of picture? You see, in the art world, there are dozens of different genres of painting. Let me sort of introduce you to just 4 of them. There's realism painting, kind of like this picture of the 1775. Again, let's take a war theme. 1775 war, the painter painted something that's obviously a painting, but it's pretty realistic. There's no symbolism. There's no hidden message. It's trying to capture a moment in time. Then you have Impressionism. And the Impressionist genre is not so detailed. It's more of gestures and more of what light can do and sort of impression and illusion. It's sort of a little bit more veiled and a little bit more abstract, but it's a picture of soldiers going over the top and advancing in war. But it's meant to be experienced as an emotion, not so much that this is what it really looked like. And then you have a genre called surrealism. Guernica is a painting. It's a fascinating painting by Picasso. It's 11 feet tall, 25 feet wide. It was painted in 1937 using gray and black and white. And again, it's about war. In fact, it's about a specific day in war. But when you take a look at it, again, it's not depicting all the details. This is not what war looks like, but it's meant to elicit an emotion and an impression. And this is surrealism. And then you have photorealism, which is, it looks like somebody took a picture. And yet this is obviously sci-fi. It's obviously fictional. This one is about English walking tanks in 1944. It's not real, but it's painted so sharply, and you can gain details out of there. Now, if we were to look at those four and say, what is apocalyptic literature most like? Well, it's most like a Picasso. Apocalyptic literature, I would say, is most like a Picasso. It's meant to communicate powerful truths and sometimes even historic events, but it's meant to do it in a way that isn't necessarily literal. So Picasso's Guernica is an anti-war painting, and so he was commissioned with painting this painting, and he was struggling to how to communicate against war. And then one day, Guernica was bombed by the Nazis. It's a little town in Spain. And it was bombed by the Nazis, and the newspaper report came out. It was so graphic and so moving. And, of course, Picasso being Spanish, he was moved to create this painting. And so it tells the story of that day in 1937. It's a description of that day, and yet we would entirely miss the point if we walked up to this painting in the gallery and we said, oh, I get it. Moving left to right, of course, the day started with a volcano that erupted. And then because of that, a woman lost her child and she was in grief. And then a dispassionate bull kind of marched through the town, but he was interrupted by a horse that was choking on a sword. But the horse stepped on a soldier and dismembered the soldier. And then 3 women came, and one of them had a candle. That's what the day was like. That's what happened on that day in Guernica. If that's the way you try to interpret this, you realize that you don't even need to be an art professional to understand that that's not how you interpret surrealism. This is not to tell the chronology of the day, but rather this was to tell something of the emotion and the feeling and to make a statement about this day. If you try to squeeze and extract information out of this that was never intended, you'll go way off base. Well, that's how it is with this genre of apocalyptic literature. In many ways, it's an extinct literary form, and it's resistance literature, and it's preoccupied with the future, and it uses discourse cycles, and it uses pictures and imagery. Apocalyptic literature is a lot like a Picasso when you walk up to it. It's not like a realism, or it's not like photorealism. And finally, apocalyptic literature is going to use imagery that the audience would have understood. It's ludicrous to think that God would have given John this revelation to write to the 7 churches who were up in that Turkey area that Pastor John showed us last week, and that they would read it and they would go, we have no clue what this means. This doesn't even make sense. This is just weird stuff. It doesn't make any sense. They understood the imagery. We don't understand the imagery, but they would have understood the imagery. And a lot of people today look at the book of Revelation, and if this is your camp, if this is where you camp, again, we're absolutely allowed to disagree, no problem. But a lot of people look at this book and say, well, what God was really doing was he was painting a picture of a mark on the hand or the forehead that obviously is an implanted computer chip. And he was talking about melting mountains, which obviously refers, what else could it refer to than nuclear war? And he was talking about armor-plated locusts, which, come on, that obviously depicts helicopter gunships. And horses with breastplates of fire, that must mean Abram tanks. But it's ludicrous to think that God would have given a picture to these people who were struggling in persecution and oppression of something that was going to happen 2,000 years in the future that they could not relate to in any way at all. Apocalyptic literature uses imagery that is known to the reader. And so even if we don't understand the imagery, this is imagery that was known to these people. Now look, I realize already in our study, what I've given you is overwhelming. And some of you are feeling it, aren't you? Some of you are feeling the, kind of the challenge coming to your upbringing or to your particular field. You're feeling some of the disorientation. You're feeling some of the, a little bit of anger at this guy. Yeah, he's right. He is wrong, right? You're feeling that, right? You're feeling, how could you, this is heresy. How could you speak against what I've learned my whole life? And all I'm saying is, hey, let's take an objective look at some of this, as objective as we possibly can. And we're going to remember those rules, right? It's okay to disagree. So here's what I want to do as we close. I want to extract some of the DNA of apocalyptic literature, and I want to reinsert it into some new words. But here's the deal. Because you are now pros on apocalyptic literature, you're going to be able to interpret this. But also because this was written, this is a piece of apocalyptic literature that was written for you. In your day, in your culture, in everything you know about North America, in everything you know about the business world, this was written for you. People 2,000 years ago wouldn't understand this. People 2,000 years from now are not going to understand this, but because you understand the imagery, you're going to get what this is talking about. Now, it's a hypothetical business situation. Let me read it to you, and let me see. Just allow yourself to draw on the images that you already know from your culture. Here we go. On that great day, the little white bird, whose number was 140, declared to all the nations that the woman with 2 tails and flowing hair, crowned with a star, would join forces with the apple whose sweet bites flooded the entire earth. The tweeting of the little bird excited the great golden bull, whose home was inside the large apple, and silenced the old bear, whose number was 201, and whose panicked voice had formed but one word, screaming to the heavens, "Sell, sell, sell!" Observing the magical union between the crowned woman who lived amongst the stars and the shiny apple that reigned upon the earth, the shy beaver of the north, whose girth reached sea to sea to sea, dreamt that one day the rulers of the southern kingdom, the elephant and the donkey, might find such a union. Now, because you live in this culture, it might not be obvious right at first, but as you begin to think about what is being said here, you're going to be able to see it, aren't you? Let's go over it again. On that great day, the little white bird, whose number was 140, declared to all the nations that the woman with 2 tails and flowing hair, crowned with a star, would join forces with the apple, whose sweet bites flooded the entire earth. The tweeting of the little bird excited the great golden bull, whose home was inside the large apple, and silenced the old bull, whose number was 201, and whose panicked voice formed the one word scream to the heavens, "Sell, sell, sell." Observing the magical union between the crowned woman who lived amongst the stars and the shiny apple that reigned upon the earth, the shy beaver of the north, whose girth reached sea to sea to sea, dreamt that one day the rulers of the southern kingdom, the elephant and the donkey, might find such a union. You understood that, didn't you? You understood that because although it's a hypothetical business report, it's basically saying that in this story, Starbucks and Apple got together and they formed a union that the stock market in New York that's 201 years old took off. And Canada said, hey, wouldn't it be great if the Republicans and the Democrats could get along in the same way as Apple and Starbucks? You understood that because the imagery was common to you. Ask somebody 2,000 years ago or 2,000 years in the future to interpret that, and they're coming up with pictures of a beaver that's 2,000 kilometers wide and a woman that's got 2 tails and her head is up in the stars. They're coming up with craziness. But because the imagery was common to you, you understood what that's like. That's what apocalyptic literature is all about. Now, last weekend, my daughter Amy and I ran our first ever 10K, and we decided to make an event of it, so we went down to Minnesota, and we had about a 7-hour drive back from Minneapolis. And so while we were driving, I said, Amy, would you download onto my phone the book of Revelation? I'd like to listen to it as a whole. And she said, you know what, instead of that, why don't I just read it to you? I said, seriously, you do that? She said, yeah. So she spent 1 hour and 6 minutes reading chapter 1 to 22 of the book of Revelation. And I've got to tell you, it was, in the last 53 years of my life, it was the most profound spiritual forming moment that I've had. It was incredible. And one of the reasons I believe is because it was read the way it was intended to be read. You see, and there was a blessing that comes. Listen to these words. Verse 3, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. That was Amy. She was blessed by that. And blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in there. You see, this book would have been sent as a letter to all these different churches, and not everybody could read. So somebody would have read it. They would have sat down for about an hour and 6 minutes, and they would have read the book of Revelation, the letter of Revelation to this church. And I understood it in a way, knowing what we know now about apocalyptic literature, in a way that I've never seen it before. And so I want to challenge you. We want to give you some tools as we move on. I want to challenge you to do the same thing. But I also want to tell you that somewhere between Minneapolis and Fargo, my fear turned to excitement. My anxiety turned to encouragement. Somewhere listening to this as we were driving along, my confusion wasn't completely dealt with, but my intrigue went way up, and my sense of hope went way up. In fact, as we were driving along, I thought, oh my goodness, I love the book of Revelation. It's so full of hope. And then I kind of felt like the Grinch, in the movie where his heart's growing too big, and I wanted to yell, "What's happening to me?" Because it was just contradicting everything that I'd grown up knowing. And yet I was so full of hope as I read it. And so we got some tools for you. If you download the Riverwood app, first of all, there's a reading plan. And on that reading plan is simply going to be the chapters that we're going to deal with in that week. So next weekend, we're going to deal with chapters 1 to 3. I would encourage you to read it not once, but I would encourage you to read it at least 2 or 3 times over this next week. Go on the app, and you'll be able to keep track with us of what to read. Then also, there's a Q&A tab on our app. And so this is an opportunity to get a little bit interactive. So as you're reading along, you go, what does that mean? What is this? We're going to do our best to try and answer those. We're going to collate those questions, and we're going to make it a little bit interactive. We're going to figure that out. And then thirdly, I have a challenge for you. If you can, find somebody that would take an hour and 6 minutes and read you the book of Revelation in one sitting. I think it'll be a profound experience, and knowing just how we've laid a foundation today, I think you'll begin to see things, and most of all, I believe that you're going to be able to begin to see Jesus in a new and profound way. So we're going to take a moment to pray. Everybody over at the warehouse and fire hall and here at the factory, would you stand with me in a sense of anticipation, and let's pray together. Oh, Lord, we've messed up so much stuff today. We've messed up some of our upbringing, some of our previous assumptions, some of our biases, some of our theology, some of our interpretations. Now we're just left wondering, well, what is this book? What is it all about? God, I pray that you would help our hearts to settle with peace, and that we would go on an honest journey and ask this book some hard questions and learn from one another, and be okay when we don't agree on stuff. But God, more than anything through this series, I pray that you would reveal Jesus again in a new and profound way. That on every page we would see Jesus and we go, oh my goodness, I don't think I knew that about him. I'm overwhelmed with this sense of what I'm learning about Jesus, not necessarily about our camp. And so God, I pray that you join us in this journey for the next 8 weeks. Do what you said you were going to do. Bless those who read, bless those who listen. And God, more than anything, just sort of reveal the hidden to us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Everybody said, Amen. I'm going to release those of you at the other sites. God bless. Have a great week.